Let's have a bit of a chat about the fabled lost city of gold that you might know as El Dorado, which is somewhere that you might have learnt about in a book or a film or a documentary or perhaps that dreadful Disney film that for some reason decided to place it in Central America despite the fact that nobody ever thought that it was there. Now, El Dorado is the fabled city of gold, which literally didn't exist, despite the fact that it existed on European maps of South America for upwards of 200 years. Now, El Dorado is various things depending on your interpretation, one being more literal, one being more mythical, because believe it or not, this is to an extent rooted in a real place, but it underwent a capricious series of Chinese whispers that largely found its genesis in Spanish and to a lesser degree Portuguese greed. Now, El Dorado basically means the gilded one. So what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the original story, which is perhaps more grounded in reality, and then we're going to talk about that capricious series of Chinese whispers that led thousands of people, and that's not an exaggeration, thousands of people to their death, looking for something that in retrospect almost definitely doesn't exist. Now, El Dorado again means the gilded one. So why does it mean that? Now, in popular culture, especially including but not limited to that modern film Paddington 3, where they spend a great deal of the film looking for El Dorado, they link it to the Incan civilization, or the civilization of the Inca, which was a civilization which punctuated a great proportion of northeast South America, notably countries like modern-day Colombia. But believe it or not, despite popular culture constantly trying to convince us that this was associated with the Inca, it actually had very little to do with them originally. It was actually to do with a civilization further south that was never part of the Incan Empire called the Muisca, which is perhaps a lesser known civilization. Similar cultures in the way that two cultures that are geographically close to one another are similar but are culturally distinct from one another. So the Muisca used to have a ceremony, perhaps a coronation if you will, where they would ascend someone to the position of the top of the hierarchy of Muiscan civilization. So what they would do is they would go on a boat into a lagoon or a lake called Guatavita. Now, here they would shroud this character in gold, and then they would cast that gold into the lagoon of Guatavita. Now, when the Spanish started to conquer large swathes of South America, they got wind of this ceremony that had been going on for generations. So one of the things that they did as a result and as an extension of their quite insidious greed and infatuation with gold is they got thousands of members of forced labour to try and literally drain this lake. Originally, they started doing this with buckets, which is remarkably inefficient, and then gradually over different stages of this process, they got gradually more elaborate and practical, and eventually they got down to about 20 degrees of drainage, or 20 metres of drainage. Now, this wraps itself around a little bit of karma, or at least karma wraps itself around this process, because this was a very, very, very horrific form of forced labour that they were subjecting the indigenous people of the Muisca and the Inca to perform, and when they did find gold, they found emeralds that had been cast over a series of generations into this lake. But here's the karma. Because of the hot climate that seems to punctuate this part of the world, as the water level was draining, a lot of the gold that otherwise would have been found in the sand on the periphery of Lake Guatavita or Lagoon Guatavita actually solidified into what can best be described as concrete. So although there was a respectable amount of gold and emeralds and jewels found in this ecosystem, most of it was inaccessible because the sand dried into concrete, and the parts that were found in no way were enough to actually fund these quite elaborate and expensive expeditions to try and drain a lake which had enormous cultural and ritual significance to the Muisca people. Now, when the Europeans went into South America, most notably the Portuguese in places like modern-day Brazil, or the Spanish in places like Colombia, Argentina, etc., 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 they did encounter a great deal of gold. When the Spanish, for example, conquered Tenochtitlan, which is modern-day Mexico City, they found enormous amounts of gold, as they did in Incan civilization as well, which is probably why these civilizations, which are perhaps better known in popular culture, get wrapped around El Dorado. Now, when the Spanish and the Portuguese found this massive amount of gold, which was largely for ceremonial and religious purposes, they couldn't really wrap their heads around the fact that there wasn't some kind of massive Fort Knox style deposit of gold. Now, in South America, gold didn't have the kind of monetary value that it elicited in places like Europe. In Europe, throughout the 15th and 16th century, when a large portion of this was happening, the only real metrics for gold were land, which is not terribly portable, and gold, which is its portable power. So when they found it, they didn't quite wrap their heads around the fact that the Inca and the Muisca and the Aztecs weren't hoarding it somewhere. Now, these civilizations, including especially the Incan and Aztec civilizations, did have access to gold mines. But whenever they did find it in fleeting amounts, they would immediately turn it into an alloy of copper and gold, and they would turn it into ceremonial objects and things of practical significance, or they might trade it using a barter system for more life-sustaining commodities like salt, which is largely how the Muisca ended up with so much gold, because they didn't have gold mines. They would trade salt, which they did have, for gold with the Inca, which is probably again why El Dorado, the gilded one, is associated with the Inca, despite the fact that the actual original genesis of this story originates with the Muisca. Now, this underwent a capricious metamorphosis, turning it from a town into a city, into an empire of gold. And the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Germans and the British would discuss this to the point that it went through this narrative evolution into something that desperately needed to be found. So they would go in groups of hundreds and thousands, literally thousands, into the Amazon rainforest to go and find somewhere that literally didn't exist. And many of these people didn't return, which again is something that karma has wrapped itself around. Because obviously, when civilizations, quite aggressive civilizations like the Spanish conquistadores, displaced civilizations like the Inca. For example, the Spanish defeated the Inca at the Battle of Cajamarca in 1545 and displaced the remnants of these civilizations into the Amazon rainforest. So as the Spanish conquistadores were going as part of massive expeditions into the Amazon rainforest, they met a very violent demise as a result of the very civilizations that they had displaced out of the larger cities. So El Dorado is a fascinating myth, and it is very much a myth that captured the imagination of various different people around the world and various different empires, including but not limited to the British. So Walter Raleigh, who you might be vaguely familiar with, largely the reason as to why the country of Guyana was a British territory and is even a country on the map today is because Sir Walter Raleigh was sent there in order to create a base to look for the ancient fabled city of gold, aka El Dorado. That's very much the reason as to why the South American country of Guyana even exists. Now, there are various different places that the Spanish and the Portuguese and the British and the Germans became obsessed with that they looked for, none of which existed. The seven cities of Cibola, El Dorado, the fields of cinnamon, the fountain of youth. None of these places actually existed, but it didn't stop these people looking for them, which is a fantastic example of how greed stimulates Chinese whispers, and Chinese whispers lures people to their death.